Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and share some thoughts. So I'm actually a kind of policy wonk myself. I've actually served on the IEEE standards committee for many years, and I'm not doing it at the moment, but I'm actually involved in a number of AI related standards. So I thought it would be interesting to share some thoughts on this so that some people might choose to get involved, because if we're not involved in making the policy and standards, then we're not going to have a say. So it's an important thing. So I wanted to just frame it up as it's really part of a compliance landscape where we go from rules and norms and we talk about requirements, which then get turned into policies or standards, and then might also then get translated into legislation or regulations. So it's this entire landscape of compliance that I'm talking about. And what we have is sort of like a hierarchy with policy supported by standards, procedures, and guidelines, which is what we work on. And if you want to think about this, at UNSW, we actually frame all of our policies around this kind of thinking. So do you know where your data is? Do you know who's protecting it? Do you know? And that frames all of our policy work there. But there's a tremendous amount of data policy out there, and it's really important for government and business. Government seems to be more cognizant of the fact that we need to have data policies and standards, but businesses really ought to be thinking about this too, because it'll inform the way they behave. And if you've already thought about it from a policy perspective, it means that you don't have to, when a crisis hits, and go, oh, what are we going to do? Because you've already got policies and standard operating procedures. And I want to go back to 2017 when The Economist said that the world's most valuable resource is no longer oil but data. And a lot of people say this fairly glibly now, but I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, data is not really like oil. Oil's a tangible commodity. You can plonk it in a ship and transport it. It's a finite resource. It runs out. It's inert. And really only people who own oil fields can produce oil. It's relatively easily transported, and it's relatively easy to establish ownership. And oil is impersonal. Nobody cares about it. It doesn't care about us. It's not like data. Data is quite different, and really important to understand what data is. Data is an intangible commodity. It's difficult to establish ownership, and indeed a number of experts are now arguing that we shouldn't even try to establish ownership. Anyone can produce data. There's nothing stopping anyone in the world from producing data, and it's not inert, and it's almost infinite. It's incredibly cheap to produce and transport, and it can be incredibly personal. So if you think about your personally identifiable information, your medical records, your police history, your bank records, it's all incredibly personal. And data policies and standards are the beginning of how we actually protect data. And I want to just take a segue for a moment and just point out that the World Wide Web only works because of standards. So there are a tremendous number of people who've been working over the last decades to establish rules and guidelines and standards so that we can interoperate, and so that we can have code that works, that we have systems that work, and that things can interoperate. I'm old enough to remember the bad old days of the 1980s when we had all these different systems that didn't interoperate, and you could never transfer data easily from one system to another. And it was a really, it was a nightmarish time. And only the development of standards and organisations agreeing to be bound by standards makes the World Wide Web that we know of now possible. So the fact that we're on a Zoom meeting now and that we're able to communicate across distance is only possible because of we've formalised the way that the web works because of standards. So they're incredibly important. I'm actually going to go in an example for Australia of some legislation that's based about data. So why is this important? It's because privacy is actually under attack. I think privacy is almost dead, but we need to still fight a rearguard action to defend it. And there's this increased capability for AI and ML to analyse our data and to make actions on our data unsupervised. And this is also exacerbated by the risk of bias in algorithms. And this is because data is not neutral. And I say this a lot because people don't realise that by choosing to store that bit of data and not this bit of data, you've already made a value judgment in respect of that data. So literally by your choices into what data to keep and what not to keep, you're already biasing your data sets. So data is not neutral. Everyone thinks it is, but it's not. And increasingly, data is under attack by malicious actors. There's state actors, there's hackers, there's mafia, there's all sorts of people who are trying to steal our data. And it means that information security and cybersecurity really, really matters. And data policy and standards are important as part of protecting our data. Bias, I mentioned bias briefly before. I think bias is one of the biggest issues facing us at the moment in respect of data, and finding ways to build AI that doesn't discriminate and our algorithmic systems that do not discriminate is going to be one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century. And it's really, bias starts to enter in as soon as you start to frame the problem that you wanted to work on. Who's in the room when you decide on what the problem is? If it's a bunch of white blokes, then you're probably going to have some kind of white bloke framing of the problem and not an inclusive one. It can quite creep in right at the beginning. And then, as I mentioned before, data not being neutral, collecting the data. Who's collecting the data? What training data sets we're using? One thing that I think is really hilarious is that one of the big training data sets that we use is the Enron emails. And if you're talking about ethics of data, what on earth are the AIs learning from the Enron emails? Because they're not really a shining example of rectitude. And then preparing the data, as again, data is not neutral. Selection of the attributes. How do you know that you're selecting attributes that are going to be inclusive or are not discriminatory? So there's real issues in this. And I do see that finding ways to deal with bias in AI and ML is going to be a real challenge. So at UNSW, we're trying to draft a policy about how we can try to avoid bias and how we can regulate our use of AI and ML. It's quite challenging, and we've got some of the best minds in the world working with us on it, but we need to find some way to do this, and we need to find some way to get people to start thinking about these things, like who's in the room when you're framing the problem, so that we don't allow bias to creep in. And this is something from cybersecurity. They call it the CIA Triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And increasingly, confidentiality is one thing. Yes, we all want our data to be confidential where it's necessary. We want it to be available, so we want people to be able to access it. But the integrity of data, to me, is utterly fundamental. And nowadays, when we're having things like the Internet of Things, where we have devices connected and potentially algorithms making decisions on those devices unsupervised by human beings, the integrity of the data is really fundamental. So let's imagine you've got a pacemaker and that's keeping you alive, and it's sending back data to a system in the cloud. And if somebody hacks that pacemaker and tampers with the integrity of that data, it could make readings such that the pacemaker could kill you. So the integrity of data is really, really important now. And if you think about that, it's now possible to have deepfake videos, and it's possible for hackers to plant data on devices to incriminate people and things. So data integrity is really critical now. So this is all really leading to this whole thing of integrity of data is the one thing that really worries me nowadays. It's what keeps me up at night. So let's take a look at the example. So I want to look at the consumer data right, which is some legislation in Australia it starts with open banking, but it's meant to be across the entire economy by the end of it. This is literally based on some legislation that the UK enacted a couple of years ago, and they did it purely in the banking sector. This is a much more ambitious thing, and they're taking it seriously. You can tell it's serious because they've got sensible penalties, you know, $2.1 million for business and stuff. But they're starting with open banking, and it's a consumer data right, and it means that we can more easily transfer our data from one provider to another. And it's been slightly delayed here in Australia, but it's still happening. So our banks are going to have to, on demand, fork up our data in machine readable format to another provider at our request. Now, this is a huge change in how organisations are being expected to manage data. And if you don't think that organisations are going to need to develop some policy and some standards to do this, you'd be wrong. And CSIRO's Data 61 have been appointed as the data standards body for this whole legislative regime, and they're working with the chair. They have a data standards chair and an advisory committee. So this is being done by the ACCC as the lead regulator, and the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner protecting the consumer data rights. So you can see there's a really broad legislative framework here, and it's all underpinned by data. So standards, data policy and standards are now going to be underpinning our entire economy in important ways. And I don't think everybody's kind of worked this out yet. So data policy and standards are increasingly important. They can have a direct impact on our everyday life, for example, our banking. And we need to protect privacy and ensure that our data is protected. And this is increasingly important for good cybersecurity practices. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that for a moment. Data governance becomes really important as part of this. And data governance is really a policy and standards sort of framework. But data governance is how an organisation works out economically what data they need to protect or privilege over other data, because data is not neutral. So organisations need to use good data governance practice to identify their core data assets, so what we refer to in the trade as their crown jewels, and ensure that they are protected by cybersecurity from attack, so that their integrity is maintained and so that they can be accessed. And it's fundamental for the future that everybody start to realise that data is an asset and it needs to be managed as an asset. And I think increasingly businesses are being valued on their data. Facebook, Google, they're data-driven businesses. They're increasingly the kind of businesses that are going to survive in this COVID-19 world. A lot of industries are going to be shaken to the core. So I think this is a fundamental thing that organisations need to understand. They need to understand that with the increased digitisation of business, data is a key asset. It needs to be treated like an asset. So you need to have your board of directors to take as much care with how they manage their data as they do with their other asset, plant and equipment. So, you know, the same care that they had for the blast furnace that they invested in, they'll need to actually start paying attention to their investments in respect of data. So data policy will underpin a lot of what's going to happen in the future for business. It's really quite a significant thing. So I'll just stop sharing now. And I'm just going to actually look at some questions.
So Kate, that was great. Great start there. And I wouldn't mind just touching base. I think it's a really interesting concept, sort of beginning on understanding that data is most sort of like it's the fundamental thing, and yet it can, you know, I think someone's mentioned there about robo-debt. We've seen data being, as you say, it needs to be treated with care. You've worked in many different organisations since I've known you, I think Westfield and now into university and a few in between. I mean, how do you encourage an organisation, or how do we embed that sort of care around data? I know this is your, you know, lifelong job now. So tell me, you know, and I know your talk, we'll get on, I think, a little bit to the whole idea of around the policy, but in terms of bringing together the will, I just wondered if you could share a little bit about that.
Well, you know, the easy answer is appoint a chief data officer, to echo Leanne. No, because having somebody who's responsible for it at an organisational level is a really important thing. And I think it's in having somebody who has a focus for data and managing data as an asset for an organisation is an important thing. And it was fascinating when I got appointed as Chief Data Officer at University of New South Wales, because we had no real idea of what the role was and what it could be, but we started with that fundamental thing: data's an asset. How do we look after it, and how do we do that? And there's been a lot of work done in securing it. So I work very closely with the Chief Information Security Officer, the Director of Risk, and the Privacy Officer. So it's a team sport, and having that broad organisation-wide view of it is the key to it. But understanding it's a coalition. So that's I think the most important thing. And I think there's an interesting question there about bias in the data collection was one of the underlying robo-debt problems. I think they had bigger problems than that. I count robo-debt as the most egregious attack on its citizens by a government in the history of Australia. So I'm not a big fan of robo-debt. I'm very glad to see it's been struck down.
There was another question there, Kate, about whether there was the apparent contradiction between data as an asset and data as not oil and perhaps free.
Well, the thing is that data can be generated by anyone. That you know, we see it on YouTube. There's teenagers in their bedrooms making data. You know, it's videos, but it's data. Everybody can generate it. The interesting thing is, how do you value it and how do you monetize it? And one of the things that I did at Westfield was we looked at all sorts of ways to monetize a whole lot of different kinds of data that we had on shoppers, and literally it wasn't worth that much at the time. And so, you know, we thought we had an asset, but nobody wanted to buy our asset at the time. So that was a really interesting experience. Now I think everybody's got a slightly different attitude to it, because now we can see so much of, we had very broad-based measures, you know, how many people came into the mall. We had people standing in doorways counting them. Now it's all electronic and it's digital. So, you know, we can work out when people come in, when they join the Wi-Fi. You know, you can work out who's where now. And it's very valuable to an organisation to be able to work out who's where and all of that foot traffic. So in the space of like 10 years, we've gone from that data is not very valuable to now it's a real asset for the business. So things have really changed in 10 years. I'm going to be fascinated by how much they'll change in the next 10 years.
Yes, that's so true, isn't it? So I just wondered, I mean, you've been working on policy and how data policy can help direct things within the university. I mean, whereabouts are you at in your journey?
So we're 5 years down the track in our journey. So we started with a data governance policy 5 years ago, and we're now going to be using policy as a tool to save money. That's where we're at. So we're going to be doing a policy and procedural framework that outlines when we will store staff data and when we will delete staff data. And that will save us a fair bit of money. So you can even save money with policy if you do it right. So we've always just kept all of the staff data forever, because I don't know why. And so we're going to launch policy in the next couple of months that says a certain time after a staff member ceases employment with us, we're going to delete the data on their home drive, which will save us a considerable amount of money, which is very welcome in these COVID-19 times. So, you know, there's all of these practices around your data that you might not even know that are happening. And if you have somebody who's responsible for both data and data policy, you can go and poke around and go, well, we can save some money here. Would you really want to do that? And people go, oh yeah, I'd like to save some money.
I wondered about that, because in the early days of cybersec, it was almost, you know, that it was someone else's responsibility. People, you know, when the question was asked around cybersecurity, people would say, oh, that's, you know, Joe over in the corner, you know, go and see them. Are you finding that people want to have these conversations around the university?
Yes. And people at the university, especially the researchers, they really want to look after their data. You know, we've got clinical researchers who, you know, might have cancer patient data or whatever they're doing. And they really want to look after that. They know they don't know how to look after it themselves. So they are really happy to have support and guidance. And we've established a team that works with them to make sure that their data is safe. And that's always our conversation is we're here to help and we want to keep your data safe. And that's hardly anyone ever says no to that kind of approach. So we've done a lot of work with providing cloud-based platforms for our people to store their data safely. So we've got encrypted systems that they can store their data safely in. And that deals with 98% of people's data at the university now. And then the 2% that have got crazy amounts of stuff, then we go and have a conversation with them. And we also triage stuff. So we only go and have conversations with people who've got sensitive or highly sensitive data. So data classification is an important part of our practice at the university. So everybody that is going to store research data has to assess what level of classification it is and work out if the place that they're going to store it is adequate to keep it secure.
You mentioned, Kate, about the consumer data right policy and where that's at. One of the questions on the channel was around the UK experience, and that someone here has said that their understanding has been a decrease in service access as challenger banks cherry pick their customers. Do you think that that's likely to happen in Australia? And what's your view actually on the CDR?
Oh yeah, so I have to confess, I spent like 20 years of my life in banking and finance, so I have few opinions on this. I think the fintech startup community in Australia is salivating for this, and they will enjoy cherry picking in the same way. But this consumer data right is a much more ambitious program than the UK one. The UK one was purely about banking. This one is across, they want it to be across the entire economy. So they want it to be across telecoms, power, everything. So banking's just the first cab off the rank, and then it's everybody. And it's being watched with great interest by people in Asia. So Singapore have done something similar. So this is the future, and I think it's a really good regime in that they've got the ACCC having oversight of it and stuff, so that it's got a competitive angle to it, so that we can maintain competition. The big four banks are not going to go anywhere, but they will definitely find competition for certain segments of their customer base will be increased. And that's good. I think it's really healthy. The four pillars has been good for stability, but bad for competition forever.
As consumers, though, have we got much to fear about it?
Not in Australia. Australia has a fairly well regulated banking and financial services sector. And even startups are fairly heavily regulated. So I don't think we're much at risk. The real issue will be, will the big four just buy all their competitors? Because that's what they've always done traditionally. That's been their way. So will we end up with the same four buying up all the startups? I know the startups would like that, but maybe that's the answer. Maybe that's the way we do competition in Australia.
So going forward, I suppose I was just interested. I mean, you were talking about the use of data and that it all starts with that. Have you got any practical things you can think of in terms of how people would go about initially looking at their data as something to protect? I mean, for those people just, and looking at these various policies and where do they go from there?
Well, so people can go to my website, datagovernance.unsw.edu.au, and that I actually shared everything that I can publicly about data governance, because when I got this job 5 years ago, I Googled it. You know, you get your job and you Google it. That's what you do. And there was literally nothing. There was all these articles about, it's a really great idea, you should totally do it, and nothing about how to do it or what to do. So that's my 5 year of lessons on that website. Is a good place to start. So I started with a data governance policy, where I just outlined some basic stuff about data and the university, that it's an asset that we need to manage. I developed a data classification standard so that we could work out what data we needed to protect. And then we have some data handling guidelines, which then tell you how to protect it. So that was the fundamentals that we got fairly in the first 2 years, and they've basically been embedded now. So pretty much everybody knows that they exist and knows that they need to do something about data.
Yes, I think that's true. In fact, the survey that we're currently doing, which I mentioned earlier today, that's asking people where they go when they've got dilemmas in the workplace, you know, when they've actually got a quandary. And it's interesting how many, you know, at this stage, and look, we're still surveying this week. Again, reminder to everyone on the line to make sure they complete it. But it's interesting, Kate, how many people seem to be in a quandary about where they go for information about the misuse of data or the way tech is being built in their company. I mean, a lot of their initial, I think more than half say their first port of call is just to discuss with a colleague. So it depends, you know, if you've got a colleague in your midst that's actually, you know, got a grasp on this. Now all the people on the line know you, so this is fantastic. They can look at your very generous website. But did you go through? I mean, just on that, you're much further along the path, but what keeps you up at night? What are the things that worry you about this next chapter as the digital revolution continues to, you know, explode?
Data integrity, the thing that I talked about with the slides, the fact that it's having now formally studied cybersecurity. So I've done some certifications and I'm doing a postgraduate study in cybersecurity, and I now know how to plant data on someone's machine, and it's quite terrifying how easy it is. So data integrity does worry me, and the need to store some immutable data is really important, and that's one of the interesting things with blockchain, is this idea of immutable storage. So in data integrity keeps me up at night. Cybersecurity keeps me up at night, because if data's an asset, you notice that nobody robs banks anymore. They're not robbing banks anymore because it's easier to sit at home in your jammies and just launch attacks from home. So, you know, criminals aren't robbing banks anymore because there's more money online than there is in banks. Yeah, so my worries are more on the cybersecurity side, but if you've got your policies all lined up and you're working collegially with the cybersecurity folks and the privacy folks and the risk folks, then I think an organisation can be in a good position to defend and maintain its assets.
And just as a veteran of the industry, I'm just interested in your current optimism for us being able to handle all of these challenges. I mean, the initial optimism around the internet and what it would unleash, I suppose we didn't necessarily foresee all of this. How do you view things? Are you an optimist still, Kate?
Oh, look, I used to be a techno-utopian. I'm slightly more jaded now. When I started in the industry, we didn't even think of cybersecurity. There was no notion of it because nobody was trying to do anything. They were the hackers back in the old days. They were trying to do more stuff with phones, with phreaking, as they used to call it, than with computers. And now it's a very different landscape. But I genuinely believe, and this is why I wanted to talk about data policy, is if we have people of goodwill working together collaboratively to agree ways that we work together, then we can build a better world. And technology can build us a better world. It already has built us a better world. The world is better than it was 20 years ago. It's better than it was 60 years ago, 100 years ago. And that a lot of that's down to technology. And I think we can build a better future. But we need to find ways to guard our data assets from bad actors. And that's state actors as well as hackers and the mafia.
Fantastic, Kate. Thank you so much for sharing with us this morning. It was really great, and good luck to you in your endeavours. We hopefully will see you at Responsible Tech next year. We're hoping everyone will not only have a look at what Kate's got on her website, but share with us anything that you have found valuable so far. And we will be consolidating those lists and putting them out later this week. But please join with me in giving Kate a really big thank you. Thanks so much, Kate.
Bye.